Thank you. I think that was a great way to kick off this track. We are going to continue with a conversation with Mafalda Duarte, who is Executive Director of the Green Climate Fund, led by Raj Kumar, our President and Editor-in-Chief. So I'll welcome you both to the stage.
Thank you. Yes, a real round of applause, because that was a fantastic panel, and we've got an incredible interview for you with Mafalda Duarte, who I think everybody has a stake in your success. Mafalda is a turnaround CEO. You've been put in place at the world's largest climate fund, the Green Climate Fund, where you're the executive director, and you've been put in place to really change that institution, to grow it, to expand it, to make it faster and more nimble. And you've got a strategy for doing that. How long have you been in the job now?
Just slightly over a year.
Just slightly over a year, but you've already put in place this vision, which is 50 by 30, $50 billion by the year 2030. And you've made a lot of changes at the organization. You're in the middle of them. Maybe let's just start with kind of a status report for people who don't know the Green Climate Fund as much, or maybe haven't followed this year of reform. What are you doing there?
Okay, hands up who doesn't know the Green Climate Fund. All right.
A couple, most of you know.
So the Green Climate Fund is one of the financial mechanisms of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And it's one of the financing instruments in the service of the Paris Agreement, to deliver the Paris Agreement. It focuses on investments in developing countries purely. So it started 10 years ago. From then until now, we have been able to commit roughly $16 billion across 130 countries, 130 developing countries, in a whole range of different sectors. The fund, as opposed to others, we know that there's a major gap in adaptation finance, and more we hear about this, also because more and more we are feeling the impacts. The GCF is actually a fund that has a mandate to split its resources, half in mitigation, half in adaptation. Besides that, in terms of the adaptation, we also have a mandate to focus on the geographies, the most vulnerable geographies. So we have a mandate to focus on small island developing states, LDCs, least developed countries, and Africa.
And I said you're a turnaround CEO. That's my term, not yours. But I said that because I think there's two main problems the world wanted you to come in and solve. One is, how do you make the GCF bigger at a time when it's really tough politically to raise money for this agency on this issue? And then the second is, how do you make it faster and better at what it does? So maybe we're just starting on the bigger part. One of your key roles is to go out there and raise money. I think you've had $33 billion pledged, but as you say, about $16 billion has actually flowed through. Among others, the United States ran out on about $1 billion dinner check, right, that we promised to pay for. How are you on raising that money in this environment when everybody, including the World Bank, now says we're a climate bank? What's it like to be out there trying to raise in this environment?
Okay, let me start by saying that, the reason why I set up this vision, this vision of 50 by 30, I presented it actually here in New York in the Climate Ambition Summit a year ago. And this is just to force myself and force the organization, and hopefully give an example to others, that we need to set ambitious targets, because we are in a crisis and the scale of the resources has to be much times higher than what we are currently supporting developing countries with. But at the same time, and this is a very strong theme coming out of this UNGA, everybody talks about the institutions that we have today are not equipped to 21st century's challenges. So any of these big organizations or small organizations, if you tell any of these organizations, now we're going to give you 3 times the resources you have, or we're going to give you 5 times, have to start to think, okay, am I really in a position to deliver these resources? So you have to then think, okay, what is it that needs to happen in the organization to be able to provide these resources at a much larger scale, but doing it efficiently, because we have a lot of processes, and Green Climate Fund is one where efficiency of processes is really necessary, and we are committing to driving that efficiency. But by the way, is the entire system.
Yeah.
Because again, if we go back to the point that we have very few years where we have a chance to meet the 1.5. And for that, we really require institutions that are a lot more fit for purpose, a lot more responsive, that can really deliver at a much larger scale at all levels, including, very importantly, like the colleague that was here before, Dugan, at the local level, which is also one of our big commitments as well in terms of targeting the most vulnerable. How do we get the money to reach the local level?
So you're trying to speed up. I know you have this 9-month goal, right, from a project being requested to actually getting money out the door. That's a very ambitious goal, but you're trying to do that. You've really remade the leadership team, right? A major change there. You've reorganized the structure of the organization. So you've gone through a lot. I guess I want to know, when you look at the changing landscape from when the Green Climate Fund was set up, I mentioned the World Bank, where you came from. People talk a lot about the capital stack. Where does the Green Climate Fund sort of fit? When all the MDBs say we're in climate now too. All the bilateral DFIs say they're in climate. You got philanthropists. Where do you have a unique value proposition in that capital stack?
And thank you for this question, because you all hear a lot about climate finance architecture and climate finance landscape and the reform of the climate financial architecture. By the way, just an aside, it was very interesting because one colleague of mine the other day said we shouldn't call it architecture, because actually architects design things that are solid in terms of structure. All of the things come together, but we are calling to this landscape an ecosystem architecture when it's so fragmented and it doesn't come together in a solid way. So this ecosystem, what I prefer to call ecosystem, I think one of the things that is important to recognize, there's a lot of talk about the MDBs and the reform of the MDBs, which is very necessary, but they are one piece of the puzzle. They are an important piece of the puzzle, but they are one piece. Funds like the Green Climate Fund, we are actually enabling them, and we are enabling other UN organizations, private sector, NGOs, local organizations, public and private. And we are enabling them because we actually have the flexibility in the resources.
Right, you can do grants, you can do equity.
We have flexibility to an extent that the multilateral development banks don't have. We can provide to private sector financial resources through financial instruments that will actually enable them then to invest in these markets, because otherwise they wouldn't invest. So that's why the ecosystem needs to come together. We know, with some of you that follow climate finance, not that long ago, there was another high-level panel on climate finance. And if nothing else, it was a good analysis in terms of bringing this to land with people, which is, we need the domestic action. We need governments to do what they need to do. They need to eliminate subsidies. They basically need to look at other fiscal tools to enable the mobilization of domestic capital for these purposes. We need the MDBs, we need the funds, we need the private sector for sure, because the quantum of investments needs to come from private sector. We need the philanthropy, we need the NGOs. All of them need to come together and play their role.
It is the idea that you because you can go really local, you're going to countries, the lowest income countries, you're finding even small scale projects you can fund, that you can get them to a point where then they're attractive to the MDBs and other DFIs to fund them to scale up the programming?
Not so much that, but what I have found interesting is that we are working, for example, I'll give you examples on both the private and the public. On the private sector side, we actually invest through, not, we invest through entities that have different scales, but we invest through equity funds that are not that large, but they in turn they provide equity to the small companies in developing countries. Small companies, entrepreneurs at the local level that actually need that support, they need that equity investment. We also provide them with technical assistance to help them think through on how they grow their businesses. So that's one way to reach the local level. We work with non-governmental organizations as well, and we want to do more. I mean, one of the things that that I have also said in terms of the new vision is there are two key objectives: is targeting the most vulnerable and the private sector capital mobilization. And targeting the most vulnerable, so it's not just about saying SIDS and LDCs in Africa, it's about how do we really target the most vulnerable. And we know we need to work with local entities. So that's why, in the Green Climate Fund, one of the very interesting things about the mandate is working with what's called direct access entities, which is the national entities. And we have a growing network of national entities that are now accredited with the fund with an interest of many more. So we have national banks, national development banks, national commercial banks, a different range of national institutions that want to work with us. And I think, that's a pretty exciting mandate because we need to empower this vast network of organizations if we're going to meet the scale of the challenge.
There was a time when climate was kind of its own little world and development was its own little world. Now, if you go to a COP, everybody's there, right? It seems like the two worlds have completely crossed. But I wonder, is there a business model for adaptation? Because adaptation is this huge need. You referred to it already. It's half of your mandate. In a way, it's development. It's health, it's water and sanitation, it's agriculture, but doing it in a way that will be resilient given the changing climate. Is there a way we can fund it at the scale that would be needed?
Yes. I mean, there's a need for a much higher scale of investments. But and again, at different scales. I'll give you a couple of examples. We are working with an equity infrastructure fund in Africa to help them invest in resilient infrastructure. But again, we provide to them junior equity, or in other cases, we provide other financial instruments. So we are meeting them in terms of what is the type of capital that they need to be able to do that. Another example is empowering the local commercial banks, local financial institutions, to then provide lines of credit to the farmers or to the other entrepreneurs, so that they can borrow to drive resilient investments. So that's another model. The other model is what I was talking about, equity again for small companies, so that they can grow their business, agribusiness. So in different sectors. So there are a variety of models. We need to scale them. We need to understand, okay, what are the models that have been successful? How do we? Sometimes the problem with funders is that we have this notion that, okay, we fund this, it's a pilot, we demonstrate, and then we want to go and demonstrate another one. And pilot another one. And while I think it's necessary to also pilot new things, we need to focus again, because of the narrow window that we have. What are the things that are really working, and that we need to scale. We need to scale up at like multiples, and bet on scaling those up. And there's also interesting things in terms of the early stage new technologies and new solutions. So GCF also in these 4 years has a very big mandate in terms of how do we support, startups, these very young companies, in developing countries that want to bring new solutions to the markets. So in that, we play that very early stage capital provider, which in the financial jargon is the venture capital. But of course, we don't take the returns of the venture capital industry. So there's a multiplicity of I think the really challenging ones, which is where we want to do more, when we're trying to focus quite a bit more, is in the really fragile, and many of these countries are also conflict-ridden countries. How does one support these communities in terms of their resilience, in terms of their livelihoods, because they end up being the most exposed and impacted as well.
I know we're basically out of time here, but one last thought from you, because there are people who argue you don't need this broad ecosystem. There's the World Bank. They're the big institute. They can do it all. You're out there trying to prove even a more fit for purpose group can be nimble, can be fast. Tell us, what is the argument you make? Because you're in these rooms with a lot of the decision makers. It's the same donors for that whole ecosystem. Can an organization that is dedicated to climate finance and adaptation in low-income countries, can it be what it needs to be? Is 50 by 30 on a path to success?
I hope so. That's our commitment. Again, coming back to, can they do it all? No, they can't do it all. I mean, and they themselves, I think, recognize it, or if not, they should recognize it. They have a model. They can adjust the model, but if we don't empower a much vaster network of organizations, they work with governments, and then on the private sector side, they work with a set of entities. But they have historically not been well positioned to do the smaller transactions, the smaller projects. What is called also in the industry, the ticket size is high. We need to be able to do that with a set of actors that they support, but we also need to do with many others. And by the way, I mean, even the reforms that we are talking about at the moment in terms of the multilateral development banks, for them to take more risk and be able, by doing so, to invest a lot more resources. But again, as I said, there are certain things that they can't do because their shareholders want them to retain their AAA credit rating. And so for that, they will, as long as they have that as a goal in terms of their shareholder base, they can only go so far.
And that's where you come in. And that's really where all of us come in. Everybody's been watching your appointment. We've been following this closely because there's been a strong sense that a turnaround was needed. And I'm thrilled to have you here after a year telling us how that's going. Please join me in thanking Mafalda Duarte.
Thank you, Raj.